Hey everyone, I think we're going to get started now. Thanks for joining the webinar today. My name is Sagar. I'm CEO and co-founder of Speakeasy. We're a company that helps other companies build amazing developer experience for their APIs and really ship a quality set of developer products for the end customers to use. So today we're going to be talking about one of the things that we do, which is build great client SDKs for our customers, and why today in the ecosystem it's hard to build a great SDK from an OpenAPI specification, and what an OpenAPI specification is. So the way we're going to structure this is I'll tell you a little bit about the ecosystem today. We'll dive into an example and actually have a set of steps on how to improve your OpenAPI specification to get it to a place where we can actually generate amazing SDKs for your end customers to use. And if you have any questions, anything at all, definitely drop them in the chat. We'll spend about 20 minutes or so actually going through the example, and then leave the time at the end for questions and discussion. So yeah, looking forward to it. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Awesome. Cool. So as we jump in, a little bit of inspiration for our company, Speakeasy. We basically started because we started to see how amazing API companies built great developer experience for the APIs by investing in huge platform engineering teams internally. And those companies that made those investments ended up growing a lot faster than others. As a developer, I think about the most common used APIs that come to mind every day. And I think about APIs like Twitter, GitHub, Algolia, Twilio, Stripe, and all of these companies have an amazing set of tools that I, as a developer, can use to get started with building on top of the API. One of those tools is an SDK. An SDK is a really nice way to start consuming an API, not have to deal with all the bare metal that the API exposes, and give you an ergonomic experience in code, down to the types that you're actually using as a developer to build out the integration with that company or that API. So there's a lot of tooling behind the scenes at these companies on how these APIs get created and how these SDKs get published. If you're building a REST API today, one of the key things that is kind of the center of the ecosystem and that your company might be investing in is building an OpenAPI spec. OpenAPI specs are the standard for REST APIs today. There's more than 5,000 APIs out there that use and publish a public REST OpenAPI specification. The benefit of using a common standard like this is that you can leverage a lot of the tooling that exists across the ecosystem, from documentation, SDKs, developer portals. A lot of this is driven today off of building an OpenAPI spec. However, the challenge has been that OpenAPI specs have been created essentially for documentation, and so a lot of teams, end up having pretty complex workflows around maintaining a spec, and they're not always optimized for creating SDKs. They're usually built out first for populating that first doc site that you put up when you launch your API. And then as your API matures and you have more users, you want to launch an SDK, you have to revisit that specification and actually make it better. Every step you take towards enriching that spec actually creates a better SDK for your customers to use. So with that said, what we'll do now is I'm going to bring up my editor. We'll dive into an example of how to go from a very bare bones OpenAPI specification for a pet store API and progressively add more and more detail and enrich it until the point that we can create a great SDK, great developer experience. And the end result of something like this is a SDK that you could host on GitHub. I'm going to show you an example of an SDK we made for a public API the other day. This is a Go SDK for a product called Postdoc, very common developer product for product analytics. And we've generated this SDK directly from an OpenAPI spec. And it's meant to be a very well-maintained ergonomic repository for this particular API, complete with usage examples and a list of all the operations that you can actually interact with when using the API. At the end of the webinar, I'll talk a little bit more about how this repo gets maintained and kind of the workflow around keeping an SDK up to date. Cool. So what I'll do now is I'm going to just bring up my VS Code and actually take you through a couple of steps. So the best way to actually start is actually take the canonical example for OpenAPI. A pet store is what the OpenAPI Foundation publishes as kind of in the getting started guide. This is how you actually go through and start to define an OpenAPI spec. So again, for those of you who may not be as familiar with OpenAPI specs, the very descriptive format for defining a REST API. In this particular OpenAPI spec, the way it's laid out is you essentially have a bit of metadata at the beginning describing the API, followed by a set of path objects that dictate the various endpoints that your API might have. And so under each of those endpoints, you have the operations, descriptions, responses, the schemas, everything that your end user would actually interact with. And so you actually, as a user, have to keep this up to date and go through and define all these elements of the schema. And so as you can see, this is a pretty simple example. We have one path called pet and has one operation called post, where you can create a new pet and a couple of responses defined, 200 successful response, as well as an invalid input response. So if we generate an SDK for this as is, it's not going to be a great experience for your end user. And that's because there just isn't a lot of information defined. It's very bare bones. So to give you an example of what that SDK could look like, I've generated an SDK for this specification, and we can actually take a look at that. It's a very simple Go client, almost like a generic HTTP wrapper that just has a struct for SDK, and then just a package with the models for the various operation types. And the operation types in this case are just a post for creating that pet, and then responses as well. So that's really it. That's the SDK. Again, not super ergonomic. Doesn't have a lot of all of the things that as an end user you would expect. And we'll talk about what those things are as we go through and add more detail here. So one of the first things that is recommended to make your OpenAPI spec better is once you have a spec defined and you have paths defined and the responses defined, you want to go through and actually extract the schemas that you're using for your requests and responses. So as an example, I've now created a slightly better version of this specification. And for this particular response for listing all pets, we define what's called a component. And under a component, we have a pet schema that we can actually now reuse, a pets schema, plural, that we can reuse anywhere else in our API. And the real benefit of this, as we'll see, is that you now have a model that your developers can reference in code. It's a completely typed model. It means that not only can they interact with the API, serialize and deserialize objects in and out, but also use that model within their own code. And so if you're a company shipping an API, you definitely want to get as sticky as you can in your consumers' integrations. And so providing these models means they're more likely to deeply integrate that API and that code base, or deeply integrate that API into that code base. So in this example, we have a pet component as well as one for error, and then a pets component as well. That's the plural of pet. So 3 different components defined here. And then when we generate the SDK for this, the benefit we see is that we now have created a set of shared models, pet and error, that can be reused in different scenarios. So that's the main difference now, is that there are these models that are fully typed, giving your end user that kind of great experience to consume the responses from your API, and the requests as well, if they're passing anything in. So that's the first kind of main step to improving your specification. We see, we've gone to thousands of specs. It's pretty 50-50 on whether people use components or not, and it's something we definitely encourage. The next step is adding what we call operation IDs. So operation IDs are not strictly necessary. They are a way to improve the specification, specifically for SDK generation. And what I mean by that is, the previous spec that we saw, let me actually pull it up side by side. Yeah. And then to the right. The previous spec we saw is also valid, but if you notice, it didn't have something called operation IDs. And the operation IDs help an SDK generator like ours actually create a more ergonomic interface. So what do we mean by ergonomic here? Listing all pets is, in this case, a get operation. But from a developer's point of view, when they're integrating your API, how do you want them to think about that operation? You can actually give it a name to which they will reference that particular operation. So in this case, I've put a very simple operation ID called list pets, but really this could be anything. This could be get all pets. It could be find me all pets in my store. It could be any semantic definition really that you want your developers to think about when using your API. So let's go with list pets and take a look at how the SDK looks once you generate it. So now that we have this generated, we actually have different operations created for each of these each of these get, post, and put verbs under each endpoint. And if we look at create pet, we actually have a create pet response for one particular operation, as well as get pet and list pets. So now when developers using your API, they will actually, and importing this SDK, they will be able to list pets. They'll be able to reference that operation as listing all pets. And again, that's completely up to you how you want to define that, but it's gives you kind of good semantic control over how your end users think about your API. So a kind of important thing to call out is that, as I mentioned, this is not strictly necessary for making a valid OpenAPI spec. It's something extra. And that's because OpenAPI specs are primarily used for documentation. So as we start to use them for code gen, we want to help users enforce, help users understand when those these new parameters like operation ID are needed. So we've actually built a validator internally that kind of points users towards that direction and encourages them to add parameters like operation ID. So I'm going to just bring up my terminal here and show you what I mean. Just going to run a quick CLI command that we have called Speakeasy validate, and we pass in API schema. This is our schema from step 2, where we didn't have any operation IDs. We see that it's a valid OpenAPI spec, but we do call out that it is missing operation IDs for the get, post, and the get by ID endpoints. So again, kind of just encouraging the user to think about adding those in, because without those, you end up getting SDK methods that are often auto-constructed from whatever the endpoint is, and you may not want a user to think about listing all pets as get pets by ID, but you may want to think about it as listing or fetching pets or whatever semantic meaning you want to ascribe to that. The next step I want to show you is something called tagging. So when we work with SDKs today, you often have to reference each operation in the SDK individually. So if I was importing this SDK somewhere, I would be doing SDK dot get or list all pets, and that's not very resource oriented. As a REST API, you want to encourage users to think about what resources you're exposing. In this case, we're exposing a pet resource, and so you may want to group all operations under a pet concept in the SDK. So really your end users are saying, your end users code out SDK.pet and then all the operations. So there's a really simple way to make that happen. And let me just bring that up here. And that's by adding simple tags into your OpenAPI spec. So in this example, I basically added a global tags concept, which is, again, part of the OpenAPI spec itself. It's native to how the open standard works. And we've given a tag called pets, and then I've just tagged every operation in paths with pets as well. And so what this does is, as I mentioned, groups the SDK operations under a pet concept or pet resource. So if we go into the SDK, look at the latest generation for this, we see all of our concepts for pets, like new pets, create pets, and get pet, are now grouped under a pet. In Go, it's just a single pets file with a pet struct, which dictates how we interact with that resource. But as a user, I now get to reference this set of resources as one, and then all the operations as part of that resource. So it's, again, more ergonomic. If you use popular SDKs out there like Twitter or Stripe or Twilio, you'll see that they often group resources like that. And again, it's to build good behavior with your developers who are using your SDKs. Just doing a quick time check. We'll quickly go through those remaining three kind of steps here. So with the steps we've gone through so far, we've basically gotten to an SDK that is reasonably well structured. We have again, it's a pretty simple SDK, but from an end user's perspective, usage looks something like this, right? They're able to import in an SDK, declare a new object, create a pet, and then handle any response or requests that they want. So pretty ergonomic, but lacking some of the, I guess, frills or some of the longer tail of issues that a developer might face when integrating an API. So those often tend to be things like dealing with multiple server URLs. So as someone building an API, you might have a sandbox and production instance. You also may have authentication schemes. And then a lot of APIs today have newer concepts like webhooks, which is, as a user, getting a handling a response yourself, and then retries and pagination. And for REST APIs, there's so many things that you could end up having to deal with as a developer. So as much as possible, we want to include those concepts into the SDK, so an end user doesn't have to go build out boilerplate to make that happen themselves. So we'll pick out a couple of those examples and show how we can actually make that happen. And so at this point, I'll start using some of the extensions that we provide that enables the SDK that gets generated to have those ergonomics built in. So I'm actually going to skip to step 6 here and show you the next version of the spec. So as I mentioned, one of the very common issues that developers face when working with an API is that APIs tend to have multiple endpoints that are hosted, right? So you tend to have a production, a sandbox, dev instance, and switching back and forth between those can be challenging. You want your SDK to actually expose those directly. So as a user, you can, you don't have to go to the doc site for the company and look up what are the different endpoints available. It's built into the SDK. So again, it's completely there in code, and your code editor will actually complete that for you. So we actually provide a couple of extensions that enable you to define multiple server URLs. So in this example, I have a production pet store URL and a sandbox pet store URL. And then a extension called Speakeasy server ID, which just gives these endpoint names. In this case, it's production and sandbox. And again, what this does is it enables the SDK to expose different sets of operations under these production and sandbox URLs. So as a user, you get that experience of not having to switch that out yourself. So if we go to the SDK, go to the main SDK, we'll see that now we actually generate two sets of servers, a server prod and a server sandbox, and as well as a two different URLs that are hosted for those. So this again gives the end user the ability to just type in SDK and then pick whether they want to use a server prod or server sandbox instance, which is again helps with the ergonomics of the experience. And then finally, wanted to take you to looking at retries and webhooks. So retries and webhooks are, again, two pretty common concepts these days with APIs. If you've worked with any very large API out there, you'll know that often you'll get hit by 429 errors, which is the API just saying you're getting rate limited. And this is very common for consumers today, especially with being so reliant on SaaS APIs for your own application. And you don't necessarily want your application to just start failing the moment that you get a 429, because often with rate limits, there's very sensible retry policies or back-off limits that you want to include for your end customers to understand and be able to retry against your API. So often companies today that have retries will hand roll that library into the SDK. So we want to give you an easy way to actually build that package into the SDK and ship it as a single library. So we have a very simple extension here called Speakeasy retries, which enables you to dictate different retry strategies. So we've picked backoff as a common strategy. And then we've actually also put in a couple of parameters on how the backoff works. We have an initial interval, a max interval, a lapse time, and an exponent. And this dictates basically how the backoff strategy works. This is the first interval of time that we wait to retry, so 500 milliseconds. This is the maximum interval that we'll wait, which is 60 seconds. And then the total time waited is not more than 5 minutes. And the way we actually move up in our intervals is defined by an exponential factor of 1.5. And then status codes for what we consider as, which codes we should actually retry on, and then whether we want any retry connection errors considered as something we should retry on as well. So network errors can be something that we might want to retry on. So once we put in this extension, what happens is in the generated SDK, we actually have a library for retries that gets automatically generated. And this enables users to now just use the API, and then anytime you're making calls and you run into the set of a 429 or 500 or whatever status codes are defined, then the SDK will automatically try spooling and retrying those requests from your app. And so that, again, saves a lot of boilerplate logic that your end developers would have to write. And so you want to ship that as part of the SDK. And then finally, webhooks. So a lot of APIs today tend to also support webhooks. So I should say a lot of companies support webhooks, where you can subscribe to a set of events, and then you will get those events whenever those system kind of things happen. So a common example would be if you're using GitHub and you want to subscribe to pull requests that your team is submitting. Those pull requests may show up in something like Slack, and you want to handle that as part of your own application. So companies often today don't have much support for webhooks in their OpenAPI spec, but since OpenAPI 3.1, you can actually define webhook types as a top-level concept in the spec. So we actually support creating models from those webhooks as well, so your end users can actually get the same experience, working with webhook payloads as they would with API requests and responses. So here's an example of a webhook type. So this is called webhook called new pet. Presumably you would subscribe to this whenever a new pet object was created in the pet store company. and then want to actually handle those values or those values in the payload as an object on your end. So this webhook type is now created as a model within the SDK. So if we go into models and we go into webhooks, you can see that NewPet is actually a structure that your consumers can work with. And now they can actually handle webhook payloads within their own code and tie that into any other logic or kind of workflows they have. So the end result here now is really an SDK that has a much more ergonomic experience than where we started. So it's something that now groups all of the operations by resource, has operation IDs or operation names that are much more sensible, has support for sandbox and prod APIs, and then also comes with the retries and webhook support built in. And so this is, again, all towards ensuring that your end user can have a great DevX when using API, and presumably also adopt your API in more scenarios and use it across the board. So yeah, that kind of covers it. We went from very basic OpenAPI specification all the way to one that is much more enriched, has a lot more metadata, and also creates a better SDK for your end users to use. Happy to answer any questions. Also share resources on how you can create your own SDKs. As I mentioned, the end kind of goal of an SDK is to have something hosted in GitHub in your package managers for your end users to use, and also be updated automatically as your API changes. So as a company, one of the things we offer is we do create a set of GitHub workflows that will automatically update the SDK as your API changes. So in this example for Postdog, we actually have our Speakeasy bot, very helpful GitHub bot, going through and every night updating the SDK and actually opening pull requests whenever there's a change to either the specification or a new instance of the generator with bug fixes. And again, the idea is that there's a workflow here that is challenging for companies to maintain, and we want to make it as easy as possible and have it be embedded directly within GitHub where the SDKs live. Yeah, happy to answer any questions or tell you more about SDKs. I think I have to press something so that people can ask questions. Give me one moment. Okay, so yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Happy to answer or put in links to resources as well. Yeah, I think the first comment for maybe good learning for someone new to OpenAPI. Absolutely, it's a pretty verbose specification, and also, as I mentioned, a lot of the stuff out there is primarily for documentation today. And so we actually want to give you a set of tools to learn OpenAPI, but also be able to operationalize it for SDK generation and hosting great SDKs. So we have a set of resources that I'll just share here that help you work through actually setting up an SDK from your spec. And I guess follow-up question, do you have any suggestions for tools to help me catch issues in OpenAPI spec? Yeah, so we actually do ship a CLI that does help catch issues in the specifications, specifically for SDK generation. You could actually try that. There's a very simple validate command that comes with the CLI. It's kind of the one that I used, and it gives you a set of suggestions on how to make the specification better. There's also some great resources out there. Companies like documentation companies like Spotlight also offer validation tools for setting up docs. There's also some great open source libraries. Happy to throw them into the chat here as well. I think final question for Mehdi, you said, is there a way to customize the SDK that we get? Yes, so there's a lot of ways to customize SDKs. As much as possible, you want to try to do it in the specification itself. So, first and foremost, making sure that all your models are typed, using things like, as we mentioned, operation IDs to actually change how your SDK methods get created. But there are a lot of scenarios I think you're alluding to where that might not be possible. So we actually do offer a set of ways to do, customize the SDK further. One of them is overriding generated names. So we have a simple extension that will actually let you do method overrides. So in this case, a very common method override that we see people wanting to do is post operations, calling them create, because create is something that, again, semantically more meaningful for a developer using the spec. So that you could use that to actually change the SDK that gets generated. There's, again, a bunch of other different customizations like readmes, usage examples, using custom server URLs, HTTP clients. Definitely feel free to walk through this. Let us know if you have any questions about any of that. Courtney, do you have additional resources to learn more about SDKs? That's a great question. There's probably not a single repository out there today where you can go to and say, like, what is a great SDK? That's honestly something we're hoping to do. I would say to learn about SDKs, probably the best thing to do is look at kind of the SDKs for some of the most used API companies out there, like Twitter, Twilio, GitHub, and look at how they create their SDKs. There is something that we have, which maybe I can share, which is we do have a directory of SDKs that we generate off of a public resource of API specs. And this is, again, if you just want to look at like SDKs for a wide variety of APIs and see what they look like, we generate them in a bunch of different languages. So I'll click into one of them, and you'll see we have like four languages here automatically generated that you can take a look at too. Yeah, thanks for the Slack, Nick Nolan. Cool. One more question from Mehdi. What about if my API requires a request to be signed? This might be a very, very specific scenario. Yes, can this be done? Yeah, so if you need your request to be signed, presumably you have like some kind of auth that you have your users use to do the signing, like a bearer token or a API key. You can actually add that through a security field within the API spec. Actually didn't go through the example today, but there's 3 or 4 types that the OpenAPI supports out of the box: basic auth, bearer token auth, and then OAuth as well. And so there's all ways to authenticate with the requests. Obviously, if there's like a custom signing, custom auth that you want for your API, then there's probably more custom functions that you do have to put into the SDK. But obviously, we'd love to learn more. Definitely join our Slack community. Happy to help you navigate that as well. Cool. While we wait for any more questions, also call out, yeah, we have a lot of resources here on our documentation side on, getting up and running with an SDK from an OpenAPI spec, and then also a set of resources on kind of additional configuration you can go through to make your SDK better, much in the same way that I showed you today. Also, yeah, definitely join our Slack space, reach out to us. We're also always happy to help you set up an SDK from scratch. And even if you don't have an OpenAPI spec, that's also fine. We can help you construct that from your docs. We do have some tooling as well to kind of bootstrap the spec from traffic that you might already have on like a live API. So there's lots of tooling here in the ecosystem. We can also help you navigate that. We've seen some teams actually like to generate OpenAPI specs from code using decorators. in the web frameworks. A lot of the frameworks for Go, TypeScript, Java have decorators that will create specifications for you. And then, you do need some kind of workflow, someone in your company to go enrich those specifications with a lot of the metadata I talked about. And again, that's something we're happy to help with. Cool. Awesome. Well, if no more questions, thank you everyone for joining and taking the time today. Hopefully we're able to give you a set of examples with resources to create great SDKs from scratch. Again, feel free to join our Slack space. You can also email me directly as well here, and we'll definitely reach out and do our best to help. Thank you all, and have a great day.